After his wife's funeral, Patrick Thompson stood in the hot San Francisco sun, feeling the weight of the moment. The air was thick with the bittersweet scent of marigolds and freshly turned soil. Around him, a group of mourners dressed in black gathered near the freshly dug grave, their faces hidden behind masks of grief. The scene was heavy, yet for Patrick, it was only a performance. He stood at the forefront, staring at the mahogany coffin that held his late wife, Sophia Anderson. His perfectly tailored black suit looked sharp against the rawness of the day. His face was a mask, the kind of face that had been practiced in sorrow but wasn't really grieving. He muttered a quiet, "Rest in peace, Sophia," as he tossed a handful of dirt onto the casket. The hollow thud of the earth hitting what echoed in the graveyard. But Patrick's eyes didn't reflect the sorrow in his voice. Instead, there was a cold, calculating gleam behind them, a hidden fire that no one around him saw. Tasha Williams, his young and striking secretary, stood nearby. Her black dress, sleek and form-fitting, seemed almost out of place at such a somber occasion. Yet, she wore it well, as if to remind everyone, especially Patrick, that she was by his side. She watched him with a look that mixed impatience with sympathy, her eyes briefly meeting his. In that glance, an unspoken understanding passed between them, one filled with hidden meanings and quiet promises. The elderly priest droned on with the final prayers, his voice tired from years of service. His words mixed with the distant hum of city traffic, creating an odd lullaby of sound. Patrick pretended to listen, but his mind was elsewhere. He barely heard the prayers. His thoughts were fixed on what would come next. The inheritance, the fortune that was so close now that Sophia's sudden death seemed like a stroke of luck. No more pretending, no more waiting. With his wife gone, the wealth that had once been just out of reach was now his for the taking. Among the mourners, high society figures and employees from Sophia's companies exchanged whispered condolences and shared memories. Their words were like background noise to Patrick as he shook hands, offered brief thanks, and accepted their sympathies with a solemn expression. But inside, his mind was racing, calculating numbers, planning a life of luxury that was about to begin. Tasha stayed close to him, offering quiet support, handing out thank-you cards to the guests. Her perfume, light but persistent, clung to the air around him, stirring memories of their secret moments together. As the mourners slowly dispersed like a flock of ravens taking flight, Patrick's thoughts turned to the future. A few days later, at the courthouse, things took a sudden turn. The lawyer, a sharp-looking man in his 50s, cleared his throat before addressing Patrick. "There's a change in the will," he announced, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of unease. A deep voice cut through Patrick's thoughts. He turned to find Mac Anderson, Sophia's nephew, standing nearby. The young man was in his mid-30s, his eyes red-rimmed from crying, but his gaze was steady and sharp. "My deepest condolences," Mac said, his voice thick with emotion. Patrick nodded, studying Mac's face. Sophia had always favored him, almost like a son. It had always irked Patrick, especially since Mac's presence seemed to have a special place in Sophia's heart. "Thank you, Mac," Patrick replied smoothly, though something about Mac's intense stare made him feel momentarily exposed. "Your aunt loved you very much. You were the son we never had." Mac's expression softened, but there was a weight in his voice. She always thought of everyone's well-being. Her generosity knew no bounds. The words carried a depth that made Patrick uneasy. It was as if Mac wasn't just speaking about the woman he had lost, but about something else, something unspoken. Before Patrick could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket, cutting through the moment. Grateful for the distraction, he gave a brief nod and stepped away from the group to take the call. "Hello," he answered quietly, turning his back to the mourners. "Mr. Thompson, this is Attorney Andrew from the notary office." The voice on the other end said, the urgency clear in his tone. "I need you to come to the courthouse tomorrow. There's an urgent matter regarding Mrs. Anderson's will that requires your immediate attention." Patrick's heart skipped a beat. Something in the lawyer's tone made him stop, his pulse quickening. Tomorrow? Can it wait a few days? We just buried my wife. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but it's of the utmost importance, the notary insisted. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., don't be late. The call ended abruptly, leaving Patrick with a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. He walked back to where Tasha was, still bidding farewell to the last of the guests, offering understanding smiles and comforting handshakes. We need to go to the civil registry tomorrow, Patrick whispered, leaning close to Tasha under the pretense of adjusting a flower on her lapel. The notary says it's urgent. Tasha gave a barely noticeable nod, her eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and caution. Do you think there'll be any problems? She murmured, keeping a somber expression for the onlookers. Patrick shook his head, offering a confident smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Not at all. It's just a formality. By this time tomorrow, we'll be celebrating our new life. As the sun began to set over the cemetery, casting long shadows over the graves and painting the sky in hues of red and violet, Patrick and Tasha exchanged a final, silent glance. The funeral was over, but for them, it was only the prelude to what was coming next. On their way out of the cemetery, Patrick couldn't shake the feeling that Mac was watching him. The young man's expression was unreadable, his gaze steady. For a moment, a chill ran down Patrick's spine, but he quickly brushed it off, attributing it to the exhaustion and stress of the day. He got into his luxury car, where Tasha was already waiting, and started the engine. As they drove away, leaving the cemetery behind, Patrick tried to push aside the nagging feeling that there were still obstacles standing between him and Sophia's fortune. The next morning, Patrick woke with an unusual energy. He hadn't slept much, but something about the day ahead felt different, charged almost. The events at the courthouse were looming, and he couldn't help but feel that the game was about to shift in his favor. Patrick dressed carefully that morning, choosing a dark gray suit that gave him an air of seriousness and respect, just the right look for the occasion. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his mind wandered to Sophia's fortune, properties in the city's most exclusive areas, shares in leading companies, foreign bank accounts, an empire built over decades that was finally within his grasp. The thought filled him with anticipation. His phone rang, pulling him from his reverie. He glanced at the screen. It was Tasha. "Good morning, love," she whispered on the other end, her voice light and warm. Ready for the big day? Patrick allowed himself a brief moment of genuine joy, his heart lighter than it had been in a while. "More than ready," he replied. "I'll meet you at the civil registry in an hour." He left his luxurious residence in Russian Hill, stepping into his brand-new Mercedes. The city traffic was its usual chaotic mess, but Patrick didn't mind. The impatient honking and the crowded streets couldn't dampen his mood today. When he arrived at the civil registry in the Roman neighborhood, he spotted Tasha standing outside, waiting for him. She looked beautiful in a simple, elegant black dress, a small silver brooch pinned to her chest. The brooch had been a gift from Sophia, given to her on her last birthday. Patrick noticed the detail, and a small but approving smile tugged at his lips. "You look perfect," he said softly, his voice just for her. Tasha's eyes met his, and though her face was a mask of contained sorrow for the sake of the onlookers, Patrick knew that beneath it was excitement. Discretion was key, and they both knew how to keep appearances. "Remember," he murmured, "discretion is key." Tasha nodded, her expression unchanged. Together, they walked toward the office of Notary Andrew. As they approached the office, Patrick froze. Standing right in front of the door was Mac Anderson, Sophia's nephew. His sudden appearance was like a cold shower, jolting both Patrick and Tasha. "Good morning, Uncle Patrick," Mac greeted, his smile polite but not quite reaching his eyes. "What a surprise to run into you here." Patrick quickly regained his composure, forcing a smile. "Mac, I didn't expect to see you. What are you doing here?" Before Mac could respond, the door to the office opened, and out walked Attorney Andrew, a short, stocky man with thick-rimmed glasses, his face set in a neutral expression. "Ah, everyone's here," he said, stepping aside to allow them to enter. "Excellent. Please come in. Mr. Thompson, Miss Williams, Mr. Anderson," he began, adjusting his glasses and peering over them at the three of them. "I've called you here today because there's an important matter we need to address regarding the will of Mrs. Sophia Anderson." Patrick leaned forward, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. "What's this about, Attorney Andrew?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "I thought everything was settled." Andrew cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Well, Mr. Thompson, there's been a change to your wife's will." His words landed like a bomb. Next to him, Tasha tense, her posture rigid. Patrick's pulse quickened as he tried to steady himself. The notary pulled an envelope from the drawer, opening it carefully. Mrs. Anderson made a modification to her will exactly 1 week ago, 3 days before her death. Patrick's eyes flicked to Mac. "That's impossible," Patrick said, his voice sharp. "Sophia never mentioned changing her will. There must be some mistake." The notary shook his head, his expression serious. "There's no mistake, Mr. Thompson. The change is legal, and it was made following all the required protocols. Mrs. Anderson was of sound mind when she made the decision." Patrick's heart sank. The will, the one he had been so sure would be in his favor, was no longer what he had thought it was. This was a blow he hadn't prepared for. His mind raced, and he tried to keep his emotions in check, but it was becoming harder by the second. Tasha shot him a quick, questioning glance, but Patrick didn't answer her. Instead, he turned his attention back to the notary. He couldn't afford to show any weakness now, not when the future was so uncertain. "So, what exactly does this change mean?" Patrick asked, his voice steady but his mind reeling. "What's been altered?" The notary folded the envelope carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. "That," he said slowly, "is what we need to discuss next." Tasha, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. "But what does this news mean exactly?" Attorney Andrew cleared his throat again before continuing. "The most significant change is the distribution of assets. Mrs. Anderson has decided to donate a large portion of her estate to various charities." Patrick felt the air leave the room. The words hit him like a slap, and his heart seemed to stop for a moment. "What percentage exactly?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 60% of her estate," the notary replied, his eyes avoiding Patrick's. The news hit Patrick like a punch to the gut. 60%. More than half of the fortune he had been so sure was his was now gone. His stomach twisted as a wave of disbelief washed over him. "This is ridiculous," Patrick shouted, losing his composure. "Sophia would never do something like this without consulting me. I demand to see that document." With a resigned expression, the notary handed Patrick a copy of the will. Patrick snatched it from his hands and began reading it frantically, searching for a mistake, a loophole, anything he could exploit. As Patrick buried himself in the document, Tasha watched the scene unfold with a mix of horror and fascination. Her dreams of a life of luxury seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. She glanced at Mac, trying to gauge his reaction, but the young man appeared oddly calm, almost indifferent. "Did you know about this?" Tasha whispered to Mac, her voice barely audible. Mac shrugged nonchalantly. Aunt Sophia was always full of surprises. His cryptic response only deepened Tasha's unease. What else did he know that they didn't? Meanwhile, Patrick reached the end of the document, his face pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looked up at the notary with a mix of desperation and disbelief. "This can't be legal," he muttered. "There has to be a way to contest this will." Attorney Andrews shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Thompson, I assure you, everything is in order." Mrs. Anderson took all the necessary legal steps to ensure her final wishes would be honored. Patrick stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "I'm not accepting this. I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll take this case all the way to the Supreme Court if I have to." Mac, who had been silent until then, spoke up in a calm but firm voice. "Uncle Patrick, I think you need to calm down and think this through. Aunt Sophia made this decision for a reason." Patrick shot Mac a hostile look. "And what do you know about Sophia's reasons? Did you have something to do with this last-minute change?" The tension in the room was palpable. The notary glanced nervously at the door, as if he feared a fight could break out at any moment. "Gentlemen, please," Attorney Andrew intervened. "I understand this news is shocking, but I assure you, everything has been done according to the law. If you wish to contest the will, that's your right, but you should know it will be a long and costly process with very little chance of success." Patrick ran a hand through his hair, messing it up in frustration. His mind raced, trying to figure out a way out of this unexpected situation. How could Sophia have done this to him? Had she found out something? Or had she simply decided in her final days to change her legacy? Seeing Patrick's agitation, Tasha decided it was time to step in. "Mr. Andrew, could we get a copy of the will to review it thoroughly? I think we all need some time to process this information." The notary nodded, visibly relieved by the suggestion. "Of course. I'll prepare certified copies for each of you. In the meantime, I suggest you carefully consider your next steps." As the notary worked on making the copies, an uncomfortable silence settled in the office. Patrick stared out the window, his mind swirling with emotions, frustration, anger, confusion. Tasha nervously fiddled with her necklace, casting furtive glances at Mac, who remained unbothered by the tension in the room. Finally, Mr. Andrew returned with the copies. "Here you go," he said, handing them out. "If you have any questions or need clarification, don't hesitate to contact me." Patrick took his copy without a word and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned to Mac. "This isn't over," Patrick said, his voice hard. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this." Mac simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Do whatever you feel is necessary, Uncle. But remember, Aunt Sophia always thought about everyone's well-being." With one last suspicious glance at Mac, Patrick left the office, followed closely by Tasha. The hallway of the registry office, which had seemed like the path to wealth just an hour ago, now felt like a dark, uncertain tunnel. As they walked toward the exit, Tasha dared to break the silence. "What are we going to do now, Patrick?" He stopped and turned to look at her, his eyes gleaming with a mix of determination and barely contained fury. "We're going to fight, Tasha. This can't end like this. Sophia had no right to do this to us." Tasha nodded, but a seed of doubt had already been planted in her mind. Did they really know Sophia as well as they thought? And what role had Mac played in all of this? As they stepped outside, the gray, threatening sky over San Francisco seemed to mirror the storm brewing in their lives. What had started as a day of hope and anticipation had quickly turned into the beginning of a battle, one that threatened to expose long-buried secrets and test loyalties they had believed to be unshakable. Patrick and Tasha walked in silence toward the parking lot, the noise of the city seeming distant and muffled by the shock of what they had just heard. When they reached the car, Patrick slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration. "Damn it," he yelled, his voice cracking slightly. All this time waiting for this moment, and now what? Tasha placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. "Patrick, we need to think clearly. Maybe there's something we can do." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "How could Sophia do this to us, Tasha? How?" "I don't know," she replied, biting her lip. "But didn't you think Max seemed like he knew more than he was letting on?" Patrick nodded slowly, his mind racing. He was always Sophia's favorite. Maybe he convinced her to change her will. But why? He already has his own fortune. What would he gain from this? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Patrick started the car, and they pulled out of the parking lot, merging into the chaotic traffic of the city. As they crawled through the congested streets, Patrick couldn't stop thinking about all the times he had fantasized about this day. It was supposed to be the start of a new life, one filled with luxury and freedom. Instead, he felt trapped, as if the walls of his perfectly planned future were closing in on him. Patrick sat back in the chair, staring at the message from Tasha. His mind whirred with possibilities. What could be so urgent? Was she panicking, or had she discovered something? He sighed, drained the rest of his whiskey, and typed a quick reply. Come over. Now. Tasha arrived within half an hour, her face pale and drawn. She looked as though she hadn't slept since they'd last parted. Patrick ushered her into the living room, where she immediately began pacing. I found something, she said, her voice low but urgent. Patrick leaned forward, his interest piqued. What is it? She pulled out a folded document from her bag and handed it to him. I talked to someone who worked on the legal side of Sophia's affairs. This might be our way in. Patrick unfolded the paper and scanned it quickly. It was a series of email correspondences between Sophia and her lawyer, discussing amendments to the will. One email caught his attention immediately. Sophia, we should review the timing of this change to ensure it won't be contested on grounds of duress or undue influence. Patrick looked up, his eyes narrowing. Undue influence? This could be exactly what we need to fight this. Tasha nodded, her pacing never stopping. I thought the same thing. If we can prove someone pressured her into making those changes, then the will could be declared invalid. Patrick finished, his tone sharper now. Tasha hesitated, her voice softening. But who would do that? Sophia didn't exactly trust many people. Patrick stared at the portrait of Sophia above the fireplace, the enigmatic smile haunting him. We need to find out who was around her in those final days, who had access to her. If it wasn't one of us. Tasha stopped pacing and turned to him, crossing her arms. Do you think it's possible she knew something about us? Could she have done this just to spite you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Patrick's jaw tightened. If she knew about us, she wouldn't have just left me out of the will. She'd have burned the entire empire to the ground to make a point. Tasha flinched at his bluntness, but said nothing. Patrick stood abruptly. We'll dig into this. Every meeting, every phone call, every person she interacted with. Someone knows more than they're letting on. And when we find out who... Tasha watched him carefully. You'll what? Confront them? Patrick turned to her, his expression unreadable. I'll do whatever it takes. Tasha's phone buzzed, breaking the tension. She glanced at the screen and frowned. What is it? Patrick asked. It's from Ramon, she said, her voice uncertain. He says he has information, but it'll cost us. Patrick's expression darkened. Of course he does. That man never does anything for free. Tasha hesitated. Do you think we should trust him? Patrick smirked bitterly. Trust? No. But we don't have the luxury of turning down leads right now. Set up a meeting. Let's see what he has to say. Tasha nodded, texting back quickly. As she did, Patrick poured himself another drink, his mind racing. The game had changed, and if Sophia thought her death was the end of it, she was wrong. This was only the beginning. Patrick clenched his jaw, trying to keep his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Did they give any demands? What do they want? Tasha nodded, her fingers trembling as she smoothed a napkin on the table. They want $500,000 in cash by the end of the week. If we don't pay, they'll spill everything about us, about the affair, everything that could destroy us. Patrick leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. $500,000 wasn't an impossible sum, but it was money they didn't have immediate access to, especially with the estate tied up in legal chaos. This is blackmail, he said, his voice low but sharp. They're bluffing. If they had anything solid, they wouldn't need to threaten. They'd just destroy us outright. Tasha shook her head, her eyes darting nervously around the cafe. What if they're not bluffing, Patrick? What if they have proof? Emails? Photos? I don't think we can take that chance. He leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper. And what happens if we pay? They'll just come back for more. People like this don't stop once they've tasted blood. Tasha swallowed hard, her eyes welling up. Then what do we do? Let them ruin us? Lose everything we've worked for? Patrick rubbed his temples, frustration etched into every line of his face. We need to figure out who's behind this. They said they're anonymous, but no one stays invisible forever. Someone close to Sophia must have seen something. We start there. Tasha sighed, her voice trembling. I don't think we have much time, Patrick. They said we'd hear from them again tomorrow with details on where to bring the money. He reached across the table, grabbing her hand. Listen to me. We're not going to let them control us. Whoever this is, they're desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy. We'll find them, and we'll stop them before they can do any more damage. Tasha nodded hesitantly, though the fear in her eyes remained. Patrick straightened in his chair, his mind already crafting a plan. First, we meet with Ramon tonight. If he really has information about Sophia's will, maybe it ties into this. Everything feels connected somehow. Once we know more, we'll decide how to handle the blackmailer. Tasha bit her lip. And if we don't find anything, then we get creative, Patrick said coldly. His tone left no room for doubt. He would do whatever it took. The two sat in tense silence for a moment, the weight of their situation pressing heavily on them. Finally, Patrick glanced at the clock. We should go. Ramon doesn't wait for anyone. Tasha nodded, and they both stood, the air between them heavy with unspoken fears. As they left the cafe, Patrick couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, feeling the prickle of unseen eyes on his back. Whoever was pulling the strings in this twisted game, Patrick vowed they wouldn't win. Patrick leaned back in his chair, his face carefully composed. What brings you here, Mac? Something on your mind? Mac folded his hands in his lap, his gaze steady but unreadable. I've been going through some of Aunt Sophia's paperwork, her personal files, you know, the ones she kept separate from the business. Patrick's stomach tightened, but he maintained a calm exterior. That's a big job. Anything interesting come up? Max smiled faintly, though it didn't soften the sharpness in his eyes. A few things. For example, did you know she had been making plans to revise her will long before she actually signed the final version? Patrick raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. I wasn't aware. Sophia didn't share much about her legal decisions with me toward the end. That's funny, Max said, his tone casual but pointed, because there are mentions of you in some of her notes. Things about trust, loyalty, and disappointment. Patrick's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Sophia and I had our disagreements, but that's normal in any marriage. Is there something specific you're trying to say, Mac? Mac leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What I'm trying to say is, I think you know more about why Aunt Sophia changed her will than you're letting on. And I think there's more to this story than anyone else knows. Patrick forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to him. You're imagining things. Sophia made her decisions for her own reasons, and if you're hoping to find some kind of scandal, you'll be disappointed. Mac's smile widened, but it was devoid of warmth. We'll see about that. You know, I've always found it fascinating how secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when people start digging. Patrick leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Be careful, Mac. Sometimes digging up secrets can backfire. You might find things you're not prepared to handle. Mac stood, adjusting his jacket. I'll take my chances. Good talk, Uncle Patrick. As Mac walked out, Patrick exhaled slowly, his carefully controlled mask slipping for a moment. Mac was definitely fishing for something, and his sudden interest in Sophia's wasn't a coincidence. Once the door closed, Patrick reached for his phone and dialed Henry. Henry, it's me. I need you to look into someone else, he said, his voice tense. Who? Henry asked. Mac Anderson, Patrick replied. Sophia's nephew. He's sniffing around, and I don't like it. Got it, Henry said. I'll see what I can dig up. After hanging up, Patrick leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The walls were closing in, and the list of people he could trust was growing shorter by the day. One thing was clear, Mac wasn't just nosy. He was dangerous, and Patrick needed to stay one step ahead if he wanted to survive this game. Patrick sat frozen in the dim light of Sophia's study, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a crushing tide. She had known every lie, every betrayal. She had carried it with her to the grave, leaving him with this final, silent judgment. He stood abruptly, pacing the room, his hands raking through his hair. "Why, Sophia?" he muttered to the empty room. "Why didn't you confront me? Why go this far?" The diary felt like a bomb ticking away in the corner of the desk. It wasn't just evidence of her pain. It was a weapon she had left behind, one he had no idea how to disarm. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "Don't be late. We need to talk." It was from Henry. Patrick exhaled sharply, his nerves stretched thin. He had to focus. Whatever Henry had found might be the key to understanding this nightmare, or stopping it. The next morning, Patrick arrived early at the dingy cafe where he had first met Henry so many years ago. The place hadn't changed much. The same peeling wallpaper, the same creaky chairs, and the same smell of burnt coffee. Henry was already there, nursing a cup of coffee, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He looked up as Patrick approached, his grizzled face breaking into a sly grin. "Right on time," Henry said, motioning for Patrick to sit. "I didn't come for small talk, Henry," Patrick replied, his tone clipped. "What did you find?" Henry leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You're not going to like it, kid. Turns out your late wife was smarter than most gave her credit for." Patrick felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Henry slid a manila folder across the table. "She didn't just change her will, Patrick. She set up safeguards, layers of them. If you try to contest it, it'll trigger an automatic audit of all her accounts, her personal records, everything. And that's not all." Patrick opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. Bank statements, private investigator reports, and something that made his blood run cold. A letter addressed to her lawyer. She left instructions. Henry continued, "If you or anyone connected to you tries to fight the will, her lawyer is to release certain documents to the press." "What kind of documents?" Patrick asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. "Proof of your affair with Tasha. Emails, photos, even a recording or two. Enough to ruin you both." Patrick clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "So this is her revenge. She wanted to destroy me." Henry shrugged. "Looks like she wanted to make sure you couldn't profit from her death." "Smart woman, really?" Patrick slammed the folder shut. "There has to be a way around this. A loophole. Something." Henry sipped his coffee, unbothered by Patrick's outburst. "There's always a way, but it won't be clean. And it won't be cheap. You sure you want to go down that road?" Patrick stared at the folder, his mind racing. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let it all slip away now. "Do whatever it takes, Henry. Just fix this." Henry nodded slowly. "All right, but don't say I didn't warn you. This could get messy." As Patrick left the cafe, the folder tucked under his arm. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched again. He glanced over his shoulder, but the crowded street seemed ordinary enough. Still, the paranoia lingered. He gritted his teeth. If Sophia had left him a trap, then he would find a way to disarm it, no matter what it cost. The decisions Patrick made in the next few hours would determine not only his financial future, but also his freedom and his conscience. Would he move forward with contesting the will, risking everything being exposed? Or would he accept defeat and live with the guilt of knowing he betrayed the woman who had given him everything? By dawn, Patrick Thompson was still awake, sitting in Sophia's study. The room was filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. In just a few hours, he would meet Henry and make his decision. But for now, in the quiet of the early morning, Patrick allowed himself to do something he hadn't done in years. He cried. He cried for Sophia, for the love they had lost, for the life they could have had. And he cried for himself, for the man he had become, As the first rays of daylight filtered through the windows, Patrick wiped away his tears and stood up. He had a decision to make, and time was running out. Mechanically, he showered and dressed, his mind still spinning with the revelations he had uncovered. As he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, a thought struck him. If Sophia could see him now, what would she feel? Would she pity him, despise him, or, perhaps, despite everything, still feel a trace of love? Patrick left the house just as the sun began to warm the streets. Morning traffic was already building, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were fixed on Dare, the old neighborhood where he and Henry used to meet. Back when Patrick was just an ambitious lawyer, and Henry was his mentor in the darker corridors of power. Henry was already there when Patrick arrived, sitting on a bench feeding the pigeons. Despite the years, he still had that grizzled, hard-boiled detective look, straight out of a noir novel. "You look like hell, kid," Henry greeted as Patrick sat down. "Thanks," Patrick replied dryly. "What have you got for me?" Henry pulled a manila envelope from his jacket and handed it to Patrick. "Here you go. Everything I could find on your wife's change of will, and other things." Patrick's hands trembled as he took the envelope. "What did you find?" "First off," Henry said, locking eyes with Patrick, "Sophia hired a private investigator a few months ago. Discreet guy, but not so discreet that I couldn't track him down." Patrick nodded, the words confirming what he had already read in Sophia's diary. "What else?" "The investigator gave her a full report on you and your little girlfriend," Henry continued. "Photos, recordings, the whole package. Sophia got it a week before she changed her will." Patrick closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a punch in the gut. She had known everything. "That's not all," Henry said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The day before she died, Sophia had a meeting with Mac. They were locked in her office for hours." "Mac!" Patrick's eyes widened. What does he have to do with any of this? Henry shrugged. "Can't say for sure, but I have a theory. I think Sophia told Mac everything, and made him some kind of guardian of her legacy." Mac's cryptic warning suddenly made sense. Patrick's voice was barely above a murmur. "Do you think Mac's the one blackmailing us?" "It's possible," Henry replied, "but there's something else you need to know." A chill ran down Patrick's spine. "What is it?" Henry glanced around before leaning in closer. "Your dear Tasha isn't as innocent as she seems. She's got a history of, let's just say, convenient relationships with powerful men. Every time, those men ended up losing a lot more than just their hearts." The revelation hit Patrick like a ton of bricks. Had he been just another one of Tasha's targets? Another wealthy man to be manipulated? "There's more detail in the report," Henry said, pointing to the envelope. "But I'll warn you, kid, you're not going to like what you read." Patrick stared at the envelope in his hands, feeling like it held a bomb about to go off. "Thanks, Henry. I owe you one." The old detective stood up, brushing crumbs off his jacket. "You don't owe me anything. Consider it one last favor for old time's sake." Henry paused, his tone turning serious. "But Patrick, be careful. You're playing with fire. You might get burned worse than you think." With those words, Henry walked away, leaving Patrick alone on the park bench. In his hands was an envelope full of secrets, and ahead of him, an impossible decision. Patrick sat there for what felt like hours, the envelope weighing heavily in his hands as if it were made of lead. Around him, the city was waking up. Families strolled through the park, office workers rushed by with their coffee, and dogs barked cheerfully. But to Patrick, everything felt surreal, like he was watching the world through a foggy window. Finally, summoning all his courage, he opened the envelope and started reading. With each page, his world fell apart a little more. The evidence was undeniable. Photos of him and Tasha in compromising situations, transcripts of phone calls, detailed reports of their secret meetings. Sophia had known everything, every sordid detail of his betrayal. But what really took his breath away was the information about Tasha. Henry hadn't exaggerated. There was a clear pattern. relationships with wealthy, powerful men, each one ending in scandal and financial ruin for them. Patrick realized with painful clarity that he was just the latest in a long line of targets. As he absorbed all this, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tasha. "Did you find out something? I need to see you." Patrick stared at the message, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. How could he have been so blind, so foolish? With trembling hands, he typed a reply. "Yeah, we need to talk. Meet me at our usual cafe in an hour." He put the report back in his briefcase and stood up. He had 1 hour to decide what to do with all this information. 1 hour to choose between truth and lies, between redemption and downfall. As he walked toward his car, Patrick Thompson realized that no matter what he chose, his life would never be the same again. The game had changed, and now it was up to him to make the final move. Patrick drove through the city streets, his mind racing. Every red light felt like torture. Every honk of a horn was a jab at his already frayed nerves. San Francisco, always chaotic, felt especially hostile today. When Patrick arrived at the cafe, he noticed Tasha was already there, sitting at a corner table, nervously fiddling with her cup. For a moment, he stayed in the car, just watching her. How could someone so beautiful be capable of so much deception? How had he been so naive? He took a deep breath and walked in. Tasha looked up and smiled, but her smile quickly faded as she saw the expression on Patrick's face. "What's going on?" she asked as he sat down. "What did you find out?" Patrick stared at her, searching her eyes for any trace of the woman he thought he knew. "I know everything," he said flatly. The color drained from Tasha's face. "What do you mean, everything?" Instead of answering, Patrick pulled out Henry's report and laid it on the table. "Read it yourself." With trembling hands, Tasha opened the envelope and began reading. Patrick watched as her expression shifted, from confusion to fear, and finally to a resigned defeat. "I can explain," she began, but Patrick raised his hand to stop her. "I don't want excuses." Tasha closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. When she opened them again, there was a hardness in her gaze that Patrick had never seen before. "The truth is, you're just like all the others, Patrick," she said, her voice icy. "A rich, powerful man who thinks he can have everything. You think you're better than the rest just because you were married. You're worse." Her words cut like knives, but Patrick remained unfazed. "And Sophia?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Did you ever think about her?" Tasha let out a bitter laugh. "Sophia? She knew exactly what you were from the beginning. Why do you think she changed her will?" "It wasn't just revenge, Patrick." "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Tasha leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. She wanted to protect her legacy. "From you, you think you were the only one playing games?" Sophia was always 10 steps ahead. She didn't trust you, and she made sure you'd never touch what she built. You weren't just her husband. You were her biggest mistake. Patrick's fist clenched under the table, but he kept his composure. "Then why are you here? Why play this game with me if you knew how it would end?" Tasha leaned back, crossing her arms. "Because I had to see how far you'd go, Patrick. And honestly, I'm not surprised. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. For the first time, Patrick felt truly powerless, the weight of his choices crushing him. This wasn't just about betrayal or revenge anymore. This was about survival. And he wasn't sure if he could survive what was coming next. It was to protect herself and her legacy from you. Each word felt like a painful revelation to Patrick. He realized how gravely he had underestimated both women. Sophia, believing he could deceive her without consequence, and Tasha, thinking her love for him was genuine. And now, Patrick asked, his voice low, exhaustion creeping in. Tasha leaned forward, her eyes hard. "You have a decision to make. You can proceed with contesting the will, but I promise you this. I will make sure every dirty detail of our affair comes to light." Patrick stared at her, stunned by her audacity. "Are you blackmailing me?" he asked, disbelief etched in his features. "I call it negotiation," Tasha replied, her smile cold. "After all, isn't that what you're best at?" She stood, grabbing her purse with deliberate precision. "You have until tomorrow to decide, Patrick. Choose wisely." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Patrick alone with his thoughts and the unbearable weight of his choices. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Patrick wandered the city aimlessly, his footsteps carrying him through streets that once signified triumph, but now served as constant reminders of his failures. Towering buildings and grand monuments felt meaningless, hollowed by the burden of his regrets. By nightfall, Patrick found himself standing before Sophia's grave at Dolores Cemetery. The marble headstone gleamed faintly in the moonlight, an unyielding testament to her finality. He stood there, silent, until the words spilled from his lips in a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, barely audible. "I'm sorry for everything." For the first time in years, his pride gave way to something far deeper, shame. As he stared at the grave, the decision formed in his mind, clear and immovable. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Mac," he said when the voice on the other end answered. "We need to talk. About Sophia's will and a lot of other things." As Patrick walked back to his car, an unexpected sense of relief washed over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt as if he was finally doing the right thing. The game was over. Patrick Thompson was ready to face the consequences of his actions. The next morning, Patrick sat across from Mac. The glass desk between them felt like an invisible wall, one that could only be breached with honesty. Mac's tone was formal, his words deliberate. "I'm glad you decided to talk, Uncle Patrick," Mac began. The familiar term felt distant, almost performative. "I assume you've come to some conclusions?" Patrick nodded, his face lined with weariness. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You could say that. I've uncovered a lot over the past few days." Mac leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And what he planned to do with that information? For a long moment, Patrick said nothing, his thoughts heavy. Finally, he let out a deep sigh. "I'm withdrawing my challenge to the will," he said, his voice steady but subdued. "Sophia, your aunt, she was right to do what she did. I don't deserve a cent of her fortune." Mac's eyes flickered with surprise, though he quickly masked it. "What made you change your mind?" Patrick reached into his briefcase and pulled out a report, placing it on the desk between them. "This, and some other revelations," he said. "I know Sophia found out about my affair with Tasha. I know she changed the will because of it. And I know you were aware of everything." Mac glanced at the report briefly, before pushing it back toward Patrick. His expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "That's right. Aunt Sophia told me everything a few days before she passed. She asked me to protect her legacy, to make sure her last wishes were fulfilled." Patrick hesitated, then asked a question he already knew the answer to. "Were you the one who blackmailed us?" Mac shook his head. "Not directly. I hired someone to do it. I didn't want you to know I was involved, at least, not at first." Patrick nodded, trying to absorb the weight of what Mac had just admitted. "And Tasha? Did you know about her background?" "We found out during the investigation," Mac confirmed. "Aunt Sophia was devastated. Not just by your betrayal, but by being deceived by someone she trusted." The guilt hit Patrick like a freight train. He had hurt the woman who had given him everything. And for what? A fleeting thrill? The excitement of something forbidden? "What happens now?" Patrick asked, his voice small, his posture slumping as vulnerability overtook him. Max studied him for a long moment before responding. "That depends on you, Uncle Patrick. Aunt Sophia, despite everything, never stopped loving you. Even in her final days, she hoped you would change, that you'd realize your mistakes." The words felt like a punch to Patrick's gut. That Sophia, even after his betrayal, had still held out hope for him filled him with overwhelming remorse. I want to make things right, Patrick said at last, his voice cracking. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to honor Sophia's memory. I want to help carry out her wishes. Mac nodded slowly, as if weighing Patrick's sincerity. That's unexpected but welcome. What exactly are you proposing? First, as I said, I'll officially withdraw the challenge to the will, Patrick began. Second, I want to help with the charitable projects Sophia was planning. I know business. I have the connections. I can be useful. And what about Tasha? Mac asked, his eyes narrowing. Patrick let out a tired sigh. It's over. In fact, she gave me an ultimatum yesterday. I think she already knows I've chosen not to continue playing her games. Mac's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. Good. That simplifies things. But you should know, Uncle Patrick, this won't be easy. People will talk. There will be rumors and speculation. I know, Patrick replied, determination hardening his tone. I'm ready for that. I've spent too long caring about appearances, worrying about what others think. It's time to face the truth, no matter the consequences. Silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic. Finally, Max stood and extended his hand. All right, Uncle Patrick. I accept your offer. We'll work together to honor Aunt Sophia's legacy. But I'm warning you, I'll be watching you closely. One misstep and it's over. Got it. Patrick stood and shook Mac's hand, feeling as though he'd just signed a solemn pact. I won't let you down this time. Not again. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Patrick officially withdrew his challenge to the will. News of his decision spread quickly among San Francisco's high society, sparking endless speculation and gossip. Just as she had threatened, Tasha tried leaking details of their affair to the press. But to her surprise, she hit a wall. Mac, anticipating her move, used his connections to ensure no major outlet would publish the story. Frustrated and defeated, Tasha eventually left the city, leaving behind only the bitter memory of a betrayal that had almost destroyed the legacy of one of San Francisco's most respected women. Meanwhile, Patrick threw himself into the work Sophia had envisioned. With Mac by his side, he spearheaded charitable projects. Schools in marginalized neighborhoods, healthcare clinics in rural communities, microcredit programs for women entrepreneurs. Each project was a step toward redemption. Critics accused Patrick of losing his ambition or going soft, but the results spoke louder than their words. A young girl attending school for the first time, a family receiving medical care they could never afford, a small business thriving thanks to a timely loan. Each success was a testament to Sophia's vision and Patrick's commitment. Slowly, the public's perception of Patrick began to shift. No longer was he seen as an opportunistic widower chasing wealth. Instead, he became a symbol of redemption, a man using his resources to make a real difference. Months later, Patrick stood once again before Sophia's grave. This time, he wasn't alone. Max stood beside him, both holding bouquets of flowers. A lot has happened since I was last here, Patrick said softly, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes that hurt you deeply. But I hope that wherever you are, you can see I'm trying to make things right. Mac placed a hand on Patrick's shoulder. I think she knows, Uncle. I think she'd be proud of what you've done these past few months. Patrick nodded, a mix of sadness and hope filling his chest. I still have a lot of work to do, a lot to make up for. But for the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm on the right path. As they walked away from the grave, the sun was setting over San Francisco, painting the horizon in golden and crimson hues. It was a breathtaking sight, a reminder that even after the darkest days, there is always the hope of a new dawn. You know, Mac, Patrick said as they approached the cemetery gates, I think I finally understand what Sophia always used to say about the true value of things. Mac looked at him curiously. What do you mean? She used to say that real wealth isn't in what you have, but in what you give, Patrick replied. A bittersweet smile lingered on Patrick's lips as he spoke softly. I had to lose everything to really understand that. Mac nodded, a rare respect evident in his expression. Aunt Sophia was always wise. I'm glad you finally got her message. As they left the cemetery, Patrick felt a quiet sense of closure. One chapter of his life was ending, but another was just beginning. The weight of his past mistakes no longer felt like chains, but stepping stones towards something better. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in years, he was sure of one thing. He would honor Sophia's legacy, not just with words, but with action. The sun dipped behind San Francisco's skyline, painting the city in deep hues of orange and purple before giving way to the night. But for Patrick Thompson, it felt like the dawn of a new day, a day filled with possibilities, forgiveness, and the chance to finally get things right. What a powerful journey Patrick went through, heartbreak to redemption. He learned the true value of life and discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to truly find yourself. If this story moved you as much as it moved me, take a moment to subscribe to my YouTube channel and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. Remember, it's never too late to make things right. Thanks you for watching, and I'll see you in my next story.